All right, so now it is my pleasure to introduce our next conversation, social justice in journalism and media. So we have Richard A. Fowler, who is joining us, and he is a television talent, radio host, and millennial messaging expert who currently serves as a progressive contributor at Fox News Channel. Fowler has been providing political and cultural analysis across the cable network's highly rated slate of programming since September 2016. Fowler also hosts the nationally syndicated Fowler Show, a weekly radio program that can be heard in more than 9.1 million homes. As a first-generation American from Jamaican parents, Fowler began his political career in his home state of Florida, volunteering with numerous local and statewide races. Since then, Fowler has been an advocate for youth, social equity, and the African-American LGBTQ+ community. Thank you so much, Richard. And joining Richard today in conversation, we have Elinor Ruth Tatum. Elinor is the publisher and editor-in-chief of the New York Amsterdam News, the oldest and largest Black newspaper in the city of New York, and one of the oldest ethnic papers in the US. Ms. Tatum was appointed to editor-in-chief in '97, becoming one of the youngest publishers in the history of Black press. She began at the newspaper as a journalist, covering issues local and national affecting Harlem and the Black community. In addition to publishing the Amsterdam News, Ms. Tatum produces and co-hosts a weekly segment of Al Sharpton's weekly radio show, Keeping It Real, a nationally syndicated talk show. In addition to her career in journalism, Ms. Tatum is a philanthropist and holds many civic positions. Thank you both. I'm going to take out my notes to start diving into this topic with you all, and I now pass the mic to you. Thank you so much.
Hey there.
Hello, how are you today?
I'm good. Happy Tuesday.
Thank you. Happy Tuesday to you as well. I just want to make a quick correction. I used to co-host Keeping It Real. I haven't done that in several years, but I did do that for about 11 years. But I stopped just a few years ago. So just didn't want Al to get mad that I'm thinking I still did that, because I no longer do that. The conversation. Yes.
Yeah, let's convert.
All right. I guess I'm leading this off then.
Yeah, I'm happy to lead it off. I'm just happy to be here with these amazing folks who are all trying to fly. So I'm here for it.
Yeah. And yeah, it's wonderful to be here with you as well. And, social justice in the media. We're in a time and a place right now where there's so much going on, and we have the opportunity to do so much, and we've got such a responsibility, I feel. There's a new story every day, and yet at the same time, we've got to keep a balance. But at the same time, how do you keep that balance and tell the stories and keep objectivity out there?
Listen, I think this is where we sort of find this is the dilemma that I think a lot of journalists, especially journalists who live at the intersections, and when I say intersections, let me define that: Black, brown, LGBTQIA. So they live at the intersection where policy has not sort of caught up with where society is. And as a result, journalism has sort of been in the lurch, right? Because what the job of journalism has and continues to be and will always be to hold power transparent and accountable. And so I think as we think about where we are now, and the case that comes to me is this case out of St. Paul, right, where this young brother was sitting in an apartment, not the person that they were looking for, but because of a failure in policy, right, because we as a society made the choice to not ban the no-knock warrant, he lost his life. And this is where journalism, I think, serves such an interesting role, because look, I often feel like we continue to live in mimic, right? Or we live in this sort of rinse, wash, repeat cycle. Because what's different between this brother and the case of Breonna Taylor? What we see is policy not working effectively, and what journalists are supposed to do, and what we are aimed to do, and what our profession has taught us to do, is to go into these situations and say, well, where was the wrong here? And obviously there was some wrong on this officer's part, but the officer lives in a system in which the system refuses to make reforms. So at that particular point, it's the job of us journalists to sort of call that to question. Why is it taking so long for common sense reforms to make its way through state legislatures, city councils, and Congress? And I think, your work at the Amsterdam sort of speaks to that, right? It's the voice of Black America in New York, but it's also the voice that holds power accountable. Why haven't we seen these changes when we've been asking for them for decades?
And it's also the responsibility of us, and I think the Black press has done a really phenomenal job at this over the decades, of telling the stories that haven't been told, because so many times there has been no attention to these issues, because especially before social media, when there wasn't somebody taking pictures of everything, there was no video of these things happening. There was no one on Twitter that was saying that this is going on. So it was not blowing up through social media to say to the world that this was happening in this corner of America or that corner of America. And when there was no clarion call, these stories were just not getting the amplification that they are now. And it was just in the corners of the Black press of America that there was this focus on it. But now we're seeing it in a whole different light, and we're getting much more attention on it. I think a perfect example of that as well is the Black men and women and young people that go missing every year. And we saw that earlier this year with the Gabby Pietro story. And there was a lot of focus after that on some of the Black men and women that went missing at the very same time.
I think that's so right, Elinor. And I mean, as you're saying that, the name that comes to mind for me is Simeon Booker. And I'm sure you know who that is, but for the audience that doesn't know, to your point, where Black media, and I think minority media for that matter, have always sort of been, in lieu of a better term, the sort of the canary in a coal mine, right? Because Simeon Booker was a reporter around the time or at the time of the Emmett Till murder. And Simeon was he was a journalist, but in his journalism and in sort of pushing this forward, the story of Emmett Till forward, he created a national movement by just doing his job, holding systems accountable. A young man died in a county in Mississippi. Where are the answers? Where is the investigation? Where is the grand jury indictment? Asking these critical questions. And anybody who's seen the movie or the miniseries that just came out about the movement, the Woman of the Movement on ABC, you see this character brought to light, and you see journalism at its finest, holding systems accountable and holding the powerful accountable, because that's what we're always supposed to do. And I think even as we sit now, where we see that journalism all across the country is under attack, and it's under attack sort of two-pronged. It's under attack, number one, because we're seeing a lack of funding for local papers and for African American papers. We're also seeing a political class that's willing to blame the media for their lack of action. We really live in a world in which, so to your point at the beginning of this conversation, we have to continue to be transparent and to be accountable in our storytelling, and we have to make sure that storytelling it supersedes all the pressures that are sort of in the way of us not being able to tell really effective and really good stories. And trust me when I say this, the most powerful thing that we do have in the social justice movement has and will continue to be our stories and our lived experiences, whether it's a story of Mamie Till or it's a story of others, right? Our stories and the folks who amplify those stories are going to be a critical part of how we move forward. I got a chance to sort of listen to the last panel where they were talking about entrepreneurship, but how do you learn about the Black-owned coffee shop in your neighborhood? How do you learn about, the new young Spitfire elected official that's willing to hold power accountable? The only way you learn about those individuals oftentimes is because there's a really good journalist who's uplifting and shining a light on their stories.
And most of the time, it's the community press, and oftentimes it's the Black press. But I wanted to go back to the Emmett Till story. I mean, when we look at Mamie Till, it was her courage to let that picture be published of her son, and the courage of the Black press to put that picture on their front pages that also galvanized the community when they saw the picture of Emmett Till on the front page of him after he had been recovered and his face and his body was completely deformed from, the beating and the swelling that it would occurred. I mean, it was, I don't know if journalists today would even print that picture. I think it took a lot of courage for both the newspapers and for her to do that at the time. And when you think about that, I don't know. Do you think they would print it today?
That's a good question. And I don't know. I think what you'll find is this. I think there'll be some publications that'll be like, we have to print this because this is about exactly what we're supposed to do, transparency and accountability and showing the world exactly what happened. And I'll think you'll find other publications that their editorial decisions would be one of, well, we don't want to divide, or we don't know, there's too many unknowns, so we're not going to print this photo. And I think this is sort of where we are. This is the reason why there's oftentimes so much mistrust for the work that we do. And it's not because there aren't good journalists doing the work and there aren't good journalists uplifting really good stories. It's that we've lived in a society in which editors and news directors have made the choice to sort of frame stories in one way. And in framing those stories in one way, they harm millions of people. And I think what we're going to have to do as sort of we move forward, especially as we sort of consider, I think we're shifting into this post-pandemic or this endemic world. What is journalism really about? And how do we continue to hold to the merits of it, understanding that we always have been and we will continue to be, whether it's from the time of Fannie Lou Hamer till now, it's about, or Ida B. Wells till now, right? It's about, how do we tell stories that impact community, and how do we tell them in truth and in accountability, understanding that without truth and accountability, we're not really telling the good story. And the story that comes to mind for me right away, Elinor, is a couple of weeks ago, well, actually a couple months ago, time flies so fast, I wrote a story about a Black woman here in the nation's capital that is one of the few Black women to own a marijuana dispensary, a medical marijuana dispensary, and is a full owner of her license. And the reason why I, as a journalist, chose to tell that story with Forbes magazine was because I'm like, it's really important that we begin to change the imagery of marijuana and drugs overall and how Black people are viewed in this sort of relationship. Because for decades, even in the Black community, right, drugs and if drugs were connected to Black folk, it was always a negative connotation. It was always connected to crime. But what was happening across the country in the late 1990s, early 2000s, was we were starting to see that what we knew all along, that there were medical benefits for marijuana. And we were also starting to see rich people, majority of them paler complexion than you and I, right, making billions of dollars off of it, while Black people and Latinx folks and LGBTQ folks were going to jail for the same crimes. So I told her story to uplift a Black woman, number one, but to uplift a Black woman who was working on changing the perception of marijuana in her community. Because what she told me in our interview, she was like, look, a lot of my customers who are medical marijuana users live in the historical Anacostia neighborhood, which is a Black neighborhood. It's a neighborhood where Frederick Douglass once lived. And we had to open up a dispensary for them so they could get the services that they need. And as a result, we have customers now from all across the District of Columbia. And so but it required them to go find this subject and feature her, for us to slowly but surely chip away at what news directors, and Elinor, you've been at the Amsterdam News for a long time, so you know this to be true. News directors at larger publications and larger outlets basically framed a narrative for the American people to believe that if you saw African Americans and you saw drugs, assume the worst. But if you saw white folks opening up dispensaries in Colorado and California, assume that it's capitalism, right? And so
but there's that question: is what happens to her customers from her community when they walk out her door? What is happening to them? Are they getting stopped for something that they're doing that is completely legal?
Exactly. Exactly.
And have you told that story yet?
And this, listen, that's probably the next story that I'll tell, right? But it's the reason why I told her story was just to do that, just to shine this light on an industry that, and she said in her interview, she's like, the legal marijuana business is still a white man's industry. And we're working to break that down. And we're also working to deal with the fact that there are people who look like me. And she said it in her interview so poignantly. There's still people that look like me who are behind bars for this. And it's not the only story I've told like that, but these are just this is how we do it. It's about, making sure that you have a diversity in who's selecting the stories. And you're also trying to figure out, well, what makes this story different? And how in this story, no matter what, can I hold folks accountable and transparent? And so my hope is that when my readers read the story and they see an African-American woman smoking a joint somewhere, they're like, oh, well, she's probably medical, or she probably got her joy from Linda Green, and this is how it's supposed to be done, instead of assuming the worst.
Well, yeah, I mean, we have to change the paradigm. And, thank God you did write that story. But, when we look at journalism in general, and when we look at the stories that we are telling, and there's a question here from Elliot Emil, and he's asking why the visuals haven't changed, and we keep on, he says, Black and brown people, the visuals haven't changed and are subtly digressing when unconscionable things happen to Black and brown people. We need to cover more than the criminal expressions of Black and brown people. But, I think that's what the Black press does that. And that's exactly what Richard is talking about right now. We are doing that. We are talking about the entrepreneurs. We are talking about, I know at the Amsterdam News, every week we're talking about all the amazing things that people in our community are doing. We're talking about the things that they're doing to stem the tide of the criminal things that have happened in the community. We're talking about the educational aspirations. We're talking about the educational attainment. We're talking about the people that are the movers and shakers in our community. We're talking about the people that are the educators. We're trying to cover all of the bases of the people that are making changes in our community and that are uplifting our communities.
No, I think that's right. And I think part of it is, I think there was a question earlier, right, that talks about, well, how do we change it? One is making sure that we continue to support papers like the Amsterdam and Black publications, but it's also making sure that we're pushing for diversity in our newsrooms. I mean, Elinor, you and I both know, having a person of color sitting in the editorial meeting makes a huge difference, because it will change because remember, we're in an industry that's driven by words and by language, right? So the word alleged versus the word indicted, and how we use the English language to talk about stories, right? And the imagery that we use is a critical part of how we begin to sort of break down where we are as a country, right? Because a lot of things are dictated by how the news shapes up a story.
Right, and even when you, for instance, write a story or get a story produced, if you have an intention of the way you want a story put out there, you can have an editor that can completely turn that around. Right. So it's not even who the journalist is and how the journalist writes it. It's how the person that gets the last person to put their hands on it before it goes into print or onto the screen. It's the editors that have that control. And if they have a different way of wanting to spin something, they can do that. And that's what's really scary.
That's the scariest part about it. And as somebody who's both a writer and somebody who's on air, I think the sort of balancing act, right, is even in on-air situations where I'm not the person controlling the copy, I'm not the person controlling the teleprompter, but I am the person controlling my commentary. So in that commentary, right away, what I'm going to do is I'm going to point out some fallacies in the copy, right? And I'm going to do that on air because I think it's important for the audience, especially the Fox audience, to see a diversity of opinions. Well, wait a minute. You can't just characterize this as this, or you just can't believe because X, it's not all the time that X plus Y equals Z. Sometimes X plus Y equals XYZ, right? And maybe you're missing a variable in how you tell this story. And that variable is critical to the viewer at home shaping in their mind how they should view this person, how they should view this story, and to a greater extent, how they should view this particular population of people. And I think where you see that most poignantly is a sort of this debate that we're having now about policing in this country, because there's this sort of argument out there that, you know, every person who you talk to who lives in community or lives in black or brown communities wants to abolish or defund the police. And from my reporting, what I actually find is that people are like, well, no, we just want them to do their jobs, right? And if they do their jobs effectively and they follow the rule book that they're trained to follow, we wouldn't have the situations that we're having. And when the rules aren't there, right? Or like, for example, this situation with the no-knock warrant, that's when we expect our elected leaders to jump in and change policy so that this doesn't happen. But when
they also want them funded equitably, so that all the funding is not going to the police, but also going to the programs that actually work to be to make a difference in their communities. I mean, so why should all the funding go to the police when there's no funding going to the community organizations that are actually making a difference and actually keeping the kids off of the street? I mean, there needs to be some equity in there, but defunding the police, I think you're correct. I don't think they want that, but they want the police to be accountable, and they want their children to be safe going outside, and they want them to be safe from both a criminal element and also from the police.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think what you find is what the media does very quickly is they will always point, like, as the saying goes in the industry, if it bleeds, it leads, right? And so instead of going to talking about and uplifting stories about policies that work, what you actually find news organizations doing is pointing out the problem. And as a result of pointing out the problem, you actually, in my opinion, you lose accountability and transparency for the elected officials in that city. And I say this to say this, and I say it this way. All across the country, what you hear every night is, oh, in all these big cities, crime is going up. But they never talk about the big cities where you see crime going down. One of those cities, I've been talking about it for a couple of weeks now, is St. Louis. So in St. Louis, the murder rate's actually down 25%. What's happening? What is the mayor of St. Louis, Tashara Jones, doing? She's putting clinicians with police officers on the street. She's hiring interrupters to help people in community de-escalate conflict. She's working with her police department to solve closed case files. And it's a three-pronged approach. It's working. Now, if journalists and editors and news directors were focusing on her story, it would then allow for those beat reporters who are in New York, or the beat reporters that are in Chicago, or the beat reporters here in DC, to then raise the question to those elected officials. Excuse me, Madam Mayor or Mr. Mayor, the policies in St. Louis seem to be working. They're doing X, Y, Z, W. Why are those policies not happening here? Right?
Because, well, Richard, I mean, that leads me exactly to what we're about to start doing at the Amsterdam News. So we're about to embark on a 3-year investigative program called Beyond the Barrel of the Gun, which is going to be looking at gun violence in New York and beyond. And the whole emphasis on this 3-year investigation is going to be looking at deeply grassroots reasons for the gun violence and the interrupters that are making a difference in it, and trying to reframe the narrative behind gun violence, and talking about the fact that it is not, we're going to try to take the criminals and take the celebrity out of gun violence and bring the celebrity to the interrupters, right, and to the people that are behind the scenes making a difference. So we're taking away, if it bleeds, it leads, and reframe the narrative completely. And so it's going to be, the celebrity is going to be in those that are making a difference rather than those that are causing pain in the commerity. And so this is an initiative that we're working on funding right now. And we are, working very, very hard in raising money to get this done. And hopefully we'll be able to start this work very, very soon.
I love that. And I think the reason why stories like that are so important is because if we don't begin to start changing the narrative and telling our own story, then what's going to happen is we will live in this sort of this current duality, right? Because in the current duality, in my opinion, I think that there is and I'd love to get your take on this, right? There's this sense that there's no, like, they've taken the humanity out of people because it's easy, right? If Derek Chauvin didn't see George Floyd as a human, because only if you didn't see him as a human could you engage with him like the way that you did 8 minutes and 46 seconds, your knee in his neck, right? Only if you didn't see him as a human. Same thing in the case for Sandra Bland. Same thing in the case for Breonna Taylor. Same thing in the case for Laquan McDonald. Tens of shots for a 15-year-old boy who was carrying a knife, right? And what we've got to begin to do, especially as journalists of color, is uplift the joy in our story, uplift the winning of our story, uplift the pride of our story. And when we do that, we will slowly but surely begin to change the narrative, because we won't be, because what the media gives you is that the Black community is poverty-stricken, depressed, and we're all committing crimes. And I'm clearly using these exacerbated.
Right. Well, in the first editorial in the first Black newspaper that was ever written, they said, Cornish and Rushform wrote, "For too long have others spoken for us."
Facts.
And that is what the Black press does. We tell our stories. We tell the stories of our communities. We tell the trials and tribulations, but we also tell the joys and the successes. And there are more joys and successes.
Yes.
And we need to highlight them, and we need to celebrate them.
Yes.
Because there is so much to celebrate in our communities. While at the same time, we do have to talk about the pain, but we have to talk about those that are helping to ease that pain and those that are helping to guide us through it and to find ways to make a better way for all those that are coming after us.
I think that's right. And the only thing I would add to it is where I get so much joy from watching my sisters do it is that you guys have done a really good job of changing your narrative. And I think for Black men, as we go into this next chapter, we're going to have to be the ones that write this chapter. It can't be written by news directors. It can't be written by police departments. It has to be written by Black men. And we got to take a page out of the sisters' book and come together and rise together. But thank you so much. This was an amazing conversation.
Thank you. And thank you, Power to Fly, for having us.
Yeah,
really appreciate it.